Chez Numana, nous sommes un catalyseur d'écosystèmes technologiques. Avec nos partenaires, nous réunissons les gens qui innovent afin de créer plus de valeur pour l'industrie des technologies et pour tout le Québec.
Chaque jour, nous posons des gestes qui contribuent à faire émerger des solutions. Nous faisons en sorte que ce qui est aujourd'hui une opportunité devienne demain une réalité.
Chez Bell, on investit dans ça. Dans elle.
Moi?
Oui, madame.
Cool.
On investit dans ça aussi. Tout ça. On investit dans tout ce beau monde. Oh, excusez. On investit dans ça. On investit dans lui. Dans elle. Oh, dans lui aussi. Nos investissements pour le mieux ne datent pas d'hier. Et ce n'est qu'un début. Mieux pour tous.
Nous comprenons les défis, les enjeux, puis la réalité des entreprises. Nous sommes des spécialistes pour vous soutenir dans la gestion des ressources humaines et la formation de la main-d'œuvre. On vous donne tous les moyens pour que les retombées en ressources humaines soient au rendez-vous.
Notre créneau, c'est la gestion des ressources humaines. Que ce soit le développement de la main-d'œuvre, l'organisation du travail, la formation, le recrutement et la mobilisation des employés.
Nos services peuvent être accompagnés d'une aide financière pour répondre aux besoins de votre entreprise. Les services de soutien et d'intégration en emploi offrent des programmes de subvention salariale qui permettent de rembourser une partie du salaire de l'employé. Nous soutenons la gestion de la diversité culturelle via différents programmes qui s'adressent autant aux employés qu'aux employeurs.
Nos services, personnalisés et sur mesure, sont adaptés à vos défis et à votre réalité d'affaires. Ce qu'on peut s'attendre lorsqu'on contacte Service Québec, qui écoute, du soutien et de l'accompagnement. Nous allons analyser vos besoins en vous invitant à compléter un outil que nous avons développé, le portrait RH. Ensuite, ensemble, nous allons établir un plan d'intervention. Vous aurez ainsi accès aux subventions et aux ressources pertinentes pour vous aider dans l'atteinte de vos objectifs.
Que ce soit pour générer de la synergie d'équipe, favoriser la collaboration, améliorer la communication ou bonifier la marque employeur, on vous appuie pour que votre entreprise se démarque.
Il est essentiel que les ressources humaines soient au cœur de votre stratégie d'affaires.
Yo soy Hans.
Yo soy Arquímedes.
Yo soy Raúl Torres.
Eu sou Eminota.
Yo soy Alejandro.
Eu sou Charles Darwin.
Yo soy Luis Pasteur.
Eu sou Maria Virginia.
Yo soy Leonardo da Vinci.
Eu sou Sócrates.
Yo soy Pitágoras.
Yo soy Ford, Henry Ford.
Eu sou Hipatia.
Yo soy Nikola Tesla.
Eu sou Josephine Bell.
Yo soy Steve Jobs.
Yo soy Stephen Hawking.
Eu sou Asimov.
Eu sou Ana.
Welcome back to Campus Party Canada. My name is Laura Beeston, and I'm delighted to be back as your co-host today. We have a wonderful day today, full of technology, inspiration, and creativity. Our guests are incredible. Jordan Souls from Rodeo FX will be here. Blockchain hero Don Tapscott will be here. We've got X Prizes Anousheh Ansari. Plus, for those of you who are with me live in the Palais des Congrès in Montreal, Quebec, we've got workshops, a hackathon, game jam, esports, basketball, VR, a job fair. Live it up. For those of you who are joining me online, thank you so much for tuning in. Please send us your questions via Slido. I will definitely be looking for your direct questions to ask all of our wonderful guests today. And make sure that you get the most out of this hybrid experience by participating. Speaking of guests, this morning we are just so lucky to be starting day 2 with John Mad Dog Hall, who is the board chair of Linux Professional Institute and the president of Linux International. He is one of the highest profile advocates for free and open source software. And since 1969, Mr. Hall has been a programmer, systems designer, administrator, product manager, technical marketing manager, educator, author, CEO, and consultant. He's done it all. He's traveled to over 100 countries speaking on the benefits of open software, and we are just so delighted that his travels found him here today at Campus Party Canada. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Mad Dog Hall.
Hello, Campuseros! My name is John Mad Dog Hall. I'm the board chair of the Linux Professional Institute and the president of Linux International. My talk today is, if you don't have free software, you don't have IT. I'd like to dedicate this talk today to Alan Turing, considered to be the father of modern-day computer science. He was a cryptologist, which you'll see how that fits in. He's also a war hero. He helped to break the German Enigma code during World War II, and he saved about 14 million lives. Laura gave a good explanation of the stuff, so I'll skip over this slide, except to say that I'm a pragmatist. Although I do believe that free software is the way to go when you're developing or supporting software, I don't spit on people that use Windows and Adobe and other closed source systems. We're first going to start off today to talk about copyright and licenses a bit so you can understand what is free software. Back before the period of about 1976, there was no copyright that could be applied to software. Software was basically looked at as being in the public domain unless you had a contract with the person that you're selling the software to. So your lawyers and their lawyers would sit down and argue for months about the terms of the contract. You'd sign the contract, and then you would have perhaps one copy of the software to run on one system used by one person. But about 1986, games were starting to come out, and people had ROMs with ones and zeros in them, and they would work very hard to produce a game, and then their competitor would buy one copy of it and mass produce it at a much lower cost, and they wouldn't sell any more. So copyright was then applied to the ones and zeros in the ROM, and then later on to the source code that created the ones and zeros. Likewise, patents were starting to be applied to software also. Now, because you had a copyrighted piece of code or a copyrighted product, you needed to have a license to tell people what they could do with it. And so licenses started to come out. And the very famous one is the EULA, the End User License Agreement, that you as a Microsoft user or as an Apple user probably clicked through, never read it, and so you don't really know what you can do with it. However, there were certain people who said, I don't really want to sell the software, I'm going to give it away. Universities, hobbyists, things like that. But because copyright was automatically applied to whatever they did, they needed to have a license that was easy to give out and tell people exactly what they could do with the software they got. And so two universities in particular, University of California, Berkeley, and MIT, created licenses which basically said, if you can read this license in the source code, then you can use this source code for any purpose and do anything you want to with it, as long as you give us credit for producing the base software. And this was followed by many, many, many other types of licenses, which sometimes differed only in the name of the license. And so there were hundreds and thousands of licenses that were proliferating. And this created a problem for the lawyers who were trying to read the licenses and figure out what you were allowed to do with the software. So the term open source was created as a group of licenses that had particular characteristics, and many of these licenses were what we called permissive licenses. And these permissive licenses said basically you could do anything you want with the software as long as you give us credit for it. Now, there was a person named Richard Stallman who created a project called GNU, G-N-U, and he was going to create a complete operating system that all the source code was available to it. So he needed a license for that. He created one called the GPL, which is the General Purpose License, General Public License, I'm sorry, and a lesser license used in subroutines that could be linked as the lesser GPL. And this license and this software under it came to be known as free software or copyleft, as a play on terms for copyright. Now these licenses required the people developing the software to make their source code changes available to anybody who they distributed the binaries to. And therefore, this was known as a restrictive license because this had certain things that you had to do if you were writing this software and using it. This was also the software was called viral by Microsoft and other vendors because as they tried to touch this software and use it, sometimes they were required to make their software also, the source code also available. And there's much, much more that I could talk about this, but we don't have time in this talk, I'm sorry. You're welcome to go out onto YouTube and look at some other videos which I've done about this. Now, another thing I want to address here, because this talk is really about security and privacy, is this age-old question of what is more secure, open source code or closed source code? People say, hey, closed source code is more secure because you have security through obscurity. You can't see the holes in it, you can't see the problems, you can't see the bugs. Therefore, it's more secure because you kind of have to guess where they are. And if that was true, then Microsoft would have the most secure source code on the face of the earth, most secure operating system. We know that's not true. so that can't be true. On the other hand, open source people say, hey, many eyes can see the issues, you can see what's wrong with it, and therefore it's going to be more secure. And that's not true either. I can say as an open source advocate, it's just not true, that neither is inherently more secure than the other. But security along these lines is not the issue. The real issue is how fast can you fix the problem when you find out what it is? Mean time to fix. And with open source code, and especially with free software, since you have the source code available, once the fix has been determined, you can apply that to every system you have. No matter how old it is, if the problem exists in that, you can fix it and create your system. Now let's compare that. Let's take a practical example of that. A little while ago, we had something known as Spectre and Meltdown, two bugs that affected almost every system on the face of the earth. It was actually a hardware problem, but the software suffered for it. Now this problem existed in Windows XP. By this time, Microsoft had gone on to later versions of Windows and had dropped support of Windows XP, but there were still hundreds of thousands of people using Windows XP out there, and they were affected by this problem. So Microsoft was forced to create this patch for Windows XP for this specific problem. The thing was, they didn't have to fix any of the other hundreds of security problems that were in the operating system, and they didn't. So the people in the governments that were still using Windows XP and are still using Windows XP today still have these bugs in the system that they can't fix. Now this brings us back to present day, where we have a lot of people using Windows 10 and Windows 11 is coming out. And Windows 11 has some very wonderful security fixes in it. They basically are using a chain of trust. We'll get to that in a moment. And so Microsoft is saying, hey, if you want a really secure system, you should be going to using Windows 11. But the problem is that Windows 11 doesn't work on a lot of older hardware. And so Microsoft says, well, for that older hardware, just replace it and use Windows 11. Well, there's a lot of people in the world that don't have the money to replace all their hardware. So Microsoft, well, that's no real big problem because we'll keep fixing bugs for Windows 10 and we'll keep fixing them and keep fixing them until we get tired of it, and then we'll drop support for it and you're stuck with it, just like with Windows XP. And this is why the free software community says that the real solution to migrating from Windows 10 is not going to Windows 11, is to go to Linux. So before we start to get into this, I want to remind everybody that the real security starts at the very bottom of the system, and then we're talking about the hardware, then the software of the operating system and applications, and then what I call Uber solutions, and also with training of people on how to use it. So let's talk about the hardware first. Hardware devices a lot of times have device drivers in them which have binary code that have binary blobs in them. Little pieces of code that you don't have the source code for, you don't know what that piece of ones and zeros does for you. And all of these are working typically at a privileged right, so that they can go anywhere and do anything inside of the operating system. You don't know what the code is doing in those systems. You don't know how it works. They could have a trapdoor or a bug in that and you can't fix it because you don't have the source code for it. And after a while, the company that made that device, whether it's a graphics board or a controller of some type, they get tired of updating these binary blobs for the operating system, and so they stop. And you may lose the use of that particular component, in which means you lose that particular board or that particular function. Now, these trapdoors and Trojan horses, they're also operating in a privileged mode, and they can be almost any place. Let's take a look at the boot code. For many years, people were using BIOS. You're all familiar with BIOS. And the fact that this new type of boot code, UEFI, is replacing that is actually a good thing, because it's going to give us much more capabilities of doing things as we start to boot the system. One of those things is something known as secure boot. It means that your operating system has to be signed by the people that turned it from source code into ones and zeros, and then that has to, when that operating system boots, it only runs signed code from the different application vendors, so people can't make fake pieces of code, insert that into your system, and have it run on the operating system. The problem with this whole setup is that certificates, which are the signed pieces of code for the operating system, only come from one particular US-based vendor. And this may be fine if you're like me, living in the United States and protected by our laws and our Constitution and things like that. But if you live outside of the United States, and I don't think anybody here lives outside the United States, right? You aren't protected by those laws and the Constitution. So you have to worry about what happens when somebody hides things inside of that code. And I'm not saying that, you know, I love Microsoft, I love my country, but we have certain times we've done some things and spied on some people and stuff like that who lived outside of the United States that were not protected by our Constitution and our laws. And sometimes we even spied on people who were inside the United States and supposedly were protected by our laws. So, if you don't really have this protection, you might think twice about using this certification process. Now, on the other hand, we have open source projects like LibreBoot and CoreBoot, which actually re-implement the boot code and allow you to see every single line of that code. You can build it yourself, you can install it in the hardware, and you can watch as it boots and does what it's supposed to. If you go down a level even below that, you have to take a look at the CPUs itself. Intel and AMD, as an example, are what we call complicated instruction set computers. Every time you execute one line or one instruction in machine code, you're actually executing maybe hundreds or thousands of lines of something called microcode. Now that microcode itself is like a tiny little program, and of course it's operating at the highest permissions. And so you don't know what's happening in that microcode. You think it's doing whatever the company told you it was going to be doing, but it could well be hiding some type of trapdoor Trojan horse that could be set off at any given time. And people say, well, Mad Dog, it would take, you know, a fabrication plant and billions of dollars to do that, if, you know, and nobody has that type of money except some of those agencies I previously talked about in the United States who have money out the yin-yang, and they could actually, and have in the past, actually created processors and controllers that had Trojan horses in them. Now, there's a different type of computer system called RISC, Reduced Instruction Set Computer, that every machine language instruction is basically one action that happens during that clock pile. There's no tiny little program stuck inside of that, and you can time those instructions to make sure that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Or, if it's simple enough, you could actually produce that processor yourself, hire a fabrication plant that you trust, and be able to make that processor in that fabrication plant and watch every step they do. There's a new technology coming out called RISC-V or RISC-V, and that was developed by the University of California, Berkeley. It's an open architecture. You don't have to pay any money to be able to use it. You don't have to pay any per CPU royalties on it. It's a completely open architecture, and there's a large community of people that are working on this that allows you to see how the processor is built, to emulate what the processor is doing, and actually build your own with a contract with the fabrication plant. Now, this is not just a CPU. The GPU, or graphical processing unit, is another example of this. You execute a few instructions, and it's actually executing millions of instructions on multiple data points, and you don't know what it's doing. You don't know what your USB controller is doing. You don't know what your Ethernet controller is doing. You don't know what your SATA controller is doing. God help you if you remember Win modems. Nobody knew what they were doing. And this is a problem. Now, what you could do is take something known as a field programmable gate array. So a transistor, another name for a transistor is a gate. Okay? It takes two transistors, two gates, to make a flip-flop. Two flip-flops make a half-adder. Two half-adders make a full-adder. A series of full-adders make a register, a series of registers, and a control unit makes a CPU. So you see that everything goes down to the transistor level. A field programmable gate array is just thousands and thousands and thousands of these transistors that you can program to be in a particular circuit, and then once you've done that, you can tell the field programmable gate array, hey, right now you're a CPU. A few minutes later, I'll reprogram you, you're going to be a GPU. A few minutes later, I'll reprogram you again, you're a controller. And so you can program these in the field, whereas a CPU or GPU is actually set up at the fabrication plant to a fixed design. What you could do is replace your GPU with a field programmable gate array, and you would then be able to know what that GPU is doing at any particular time. What's more is if the company who designed it went out of business, you have all the source code for programming the FPGA, you have the source code for making the device driver for it. You can maintain that until the dogs come home, okay? And at the University of Sao Paulo last year, they created a virtual GPU out of an FPGA that could run all of the OpenGL test suites and codecs that people normally run. Or you could replace the CPU. I mentioned the RISC-V unit already. There's already been people who have actually created a RISC-V RISC CPU out of an FPGA and put that into boards, and you can run Linux on them. Now, Linux as an operating system was always a little more secure than some other operating systems. Maybe you remember MS-DOS or the early versions of Windows 3.1. You didn't even have to log into the system. You just turned the system on, there it was. Well, Unix from the day one was already made to be a time-sharing system, so it always had to have more robust file systems, more robust permissions. TCP/IP was first developed upon Unix systems out of Berkeley, and so they had to protect against the internet from a very early age. And I know that Linux and Unix was not the only operating system that did this, but they tended to work together. So in Linux software solutions, we consider encryption to be our friend. A lot of people looked at 9/11 and other terrorist organizations and they say, these people use encryption to pass messages. Well, that may be true. But the problem is that without good encryption, you can't have good authentication. You don't know that the person you're talking to is really that person. And so what you need to do is have really good encryption and use that to authenticate who you're talking to. And every once in a while, we have politicians in the United States who know nothing about this stuff and start making laws trying to outlaw encryption, and I have to write them 4 or 5 page letters, send them overnight mail, and say, hey, idiots, stop doing this. And then 2 or 3 days later, they drop their laws. You can use PGP, which is pretty good privacy, or GPG, which is the GNU privacy model, to do encryption. You can see all the source code. You see the source code for the encryption process. Mathematically speaking, that makes it is perfectly fine. You don't even have to worry that just because it's open, it's going to somehow be easier to break. And what we should be doing is to teach people how to use encryption all the time, because even bad encryption is better than no encryption. If everybody started encrypting their lunch menus, their love letters, and everything, then the various agencies I've talked about that we don't really like that much, but we need them, would have a hard time decrypting everything. They would have to go to a court and get a subpoena to, a search warrant to make you decrypt your stuff. They'd have to have evidence on you first before they started looking at your encrypted messages, and that's what we should be doing. So with that, with using the Linux system, you can encrypt your files, you can encrypt your whole disks, you can encrypt file by file, you can encrypt your email messages. You can have really good security if you want it. Another phase of Linux security is Linux Pluggable Authentication Modules, also known as PAM. This started off back in the Unix days. This allows you to take an application and say, only this user can only be using this application, only at this time, only this particular way. This can be done completely outside of the application without changing any of the source code for the application at all. It's set up in the operating system itself. And this can allow you to have a great deal of privacy and security so that, let's say a person logs into the system. At the time they're logging into the system, that's when the system actually mounts a file system and their files become visible to the entire operating system and the potential of everybody else. When they log out, the file system is demounted and becomes invisible again. There's whole distributions of Linux that are aimed towards security. One of them is called Security Enhanced Linux, SE Linux. It was first developed by the NSA. Oh, Mad Dog, that's the group that you say we should be afraid of. But you know something? Even the NSA needs a secure Linux system. So they helped to design this, and the Linux community helped them implement it, and now Red Hat as a company supports this particular mechanism as a service. A different type of security comes from a mechanism known as AppArmor. This is more of a application by application. It's a little bit like PAM, application by application security, that's supported by systems called like SUSE and Ubuntu Linux, and Debian turns it on by default in Debian 10. The other thing you want to do is if your system is broken into, you'd like to limit the destruction that the person's going to do. One thing you can do is do a change route as they get in to actually push it off and make them think they're in your system, but they're really not. You create what is known as a jail for them, and they sit there and flounder around in your system while you try and find out who they are. We also have containers and virtual machines which help to limit the destruction that happens by putting various applications into virtual machines. KVM, Xen, and VMware are examples of that, and they're all free for Linux systems. You also have lightweight directory access protocol, and Samba can be set up with different file systems in different places. Again, utilizing PAM to help you do that, utilizing AppArmor to help you do that, to help you limit the destruction if people break into your system. Now, there's various distributions of Linux, which are also security oriented. There's an application suite called Whonix, which hides the IP address of your system as you go out across the internet. Nobody sees the IP address of your system, so nobody can take that IP address and try and attack your system with it. So it kind of hides that from you. And this actually works on Windows, Apple, and Linux. So it's a good thing to learn no matter what system you're working on. Qubes OS is a Fedora-based system. Fedora is the public community system that's produced by Red Hat. And it includes Qubix and Whonix in it, which allows you to have more security if you use that particular distribution. We also have systems that have tool-based for actually people who want to try and break into systems. Because if you've never tried to break into your system, maybe your system isn't as secure as you think it is. And there are actually operating systems set up or distributions of Linux set up that have these tools that people use to try and break into systems to see how secure they are. I'll also talk about Uber solutions. No, for my idea, if you want to talk about security, you have to do it from the very beginning. You have to architect your security solution. One of those things is don't put every piece of software with the face of the earth onto your system. Have a minimum amount of software on your system because that gives you a minimum amount of security holes in it. Tailor your system specifically for the job. If you're going to create a wireless router, just have wireless routing software in it. If you're going to have a firewall, just have firewall-oriented software in it. Also, use a different processor than people expect. You know, if you're going to have a router or a firewall, why use an Intel processor? Why not use an ARM processor? Why not use a Motorola processor? And so if people try and pollute your system by putting an application, a binary application, into your system expecting you're going to execute on it, a Motorola application doesn't work on an Intel application doesn't work on a Motorola operating system, and So limit showing yourself to the outside. Don't start up services like a web server and stuff like that on systems you want to be secure. Keep all that stuff outside of your wall of security. Use IPv6 address as your friend. You know, IPv4 is based on a 32-bit address, 4 billion particular sites. That sounds like a lot, but it's really not. IPv6 is 128 bits, and so you have 64 bits for yourself to use. Sometimes it's 48 bits. Hopefully it's 64, which gives you 4 billion times 4 billion addresses to put your system in. If you move your system around and don't put it in an obvious place, That's a lot of places that an attacker has to probe just to find your system. And if you then move your ports around inside of that address space, it's almost impossible for them to hit by accident or by probing a systematic attack the systems you've got. You can also set up what is known as honeypots to trap people in your system, to keep them there until you can call the authorities that they're trying to break in. Here's a multi-factor authentication. Microsoft has announced that in the future, if you want to, you can log into your system without having to use a password. You get this little key or use some other type of what they call multi-factor authentication to plug into your system, and once that's plugged in, any system that has that key plugged in, it assumes it's you. And other types of multi-factor authentication are facial recognition. Well, that has a problem too. You can spoof facial recognition. Fingerprint recognition. A little bit harder to spoof, but you could spoof it. Maybe so send a message to your phone, different type of authentication. But what happens if your phone isn't on you? What happens if your phone is discharged? What happens if your phone is stolen? What happens if your phone is simply lost, broken? Well, you have a problem then. Time authentication, that you can only log into the system on a particular day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, any other time, you're rejected. These are all forms of authentication. And a lot of the keys that people are buying are closed source keys. You can't see how they're made, you can't see the processor inside, you can't see the programming of it. There is an open source key made by a company called SoloKeys. They give you all the circuit diagrams, they show you all the source code that's working with them. You implement that inside of your system yourself. It's an open source solution, one that I would recommend. We're going to be having a workshop later today on the Freedom Box. This is a little server system that was set up. It's actually software only, but you put it on some type of little single board computer or regular computer system. We'll talk about that in a moment. And this is a place that you keep your most private of data. All the pictures you send to your boyfriend or girlfriend you don't want anybody else to see, your financial data, stuff like that. You can keep it in your Freedom Box and set it up so it's really hard to break into. Now, this was developed or first founded by a person named Eben Moglen. He's the person who wrote the GPL version 3. He's a lawyer and professor and an advocate at Columbia University in New York. He started about 12 years ago with this program, and 2 years ago they came out with their first version. In the meantime, they've partnered with an SBC maker, a single board computer maker, to make this tiny little box that they call the Freedom Box Pioneer. And we're actually going to have one of those in the workshop later on. Now, this can be used also as a NAS server. And all of this software is included in Debian 10. So if you have Debian 10 running on your laptop, you can set up in a Freedom Box from your laptop. I wouldn't recommend that, but you could. And you can set up a Freedom Box software in lots of different systems. You can also use this as a NAS server to serve up files to your Linux systems, your Windows systems, your Apple systems inside your house. Now here's a big long list of all the Freedom Box functionality that you can set up with the software that becomes part of Freedom Box. You can set up a virtual private network, a VPN. You can set up proxy servers. You can set up Tor servers and all different types of privacy. You can hide your IP addresses as you go out across the net. Lots and lots of different security-oriented software. But you can also set up things like a library of ebooks that you can then share with your friends through passwords with different types of permissions and things like that. So it's really a huge amount of functionality, and it's all managed through a front panel that's relatively easy to use. Ideally, we'd like mom and pop to be able to do this, but we're not quite there yet. Sometime in the future, we might be, assuming that mom and pop are a systems administrator. But on top of that, you can put things which we call federated systems. Now, some of you may have used Facebook. I'm sure you've heard of it. Other people use other types of, Telegram and WhatsApp and chat servers and stuff like that. But most of these are configured to a central server, which gives them a point of attack. that they can find out your passwords if they break in and other types of information. So a federated system has no central point of control, and you and a group of friends can set up your federated social systems like Diaspora or Mastodon, and could do social to do things that you want to do, and there's no central point of control of that, no place for people to get all of your passwords and everything else. Now, besides all the things I've talked about, when you're trying to set up security, you need to think about a firewall, and setting up your firewall with the rules that say packets going in and out, what packets can come in, what packets can go out. That helps to protect the rest of your systems in your home or in your business. You want to set up a demilitarized zone outside of the firewall for things like, Wi-Fi hotspots and stuff like that. Things people can get to that you don't care that they get to. In fact, you want them to be able to use that. But that's outside of your firewall. This is what I talk about when you have an architected security framework. You want to be able to use virtual private networks so that nobody can see inside your network. It's encrypted end to end. And you want to use DNSSEC if you're going to be setting up a DNS server to make sure, or using a real DNS server to make sure that the DNS server you're querying is the DNS server that actually has the right information. Now, all of this has to be used along with training of the users. Hopefully the users don't have to be trained to the teeth, but they need to know, don't put their password on the little sticky pad and glue it to their monitor anymore. Don't do that. Don't use the same password every place. Don't make it so simple, it's crazy. You have to train your users in this, and you have to make them understand that this is important. I'm sure you've all seen some of the problems we've had with ransomware, with people breaking into systems and bringing it down, things like that. So you need to have people trained and know what they're doing, and that's where LPI comes in as a certification organization. We don't do training. We rely on partners to do training, but what we do is create the tests to make sure that the people taking the test at least can say the word security. And therefore, we try and keep the test prices as low as possible. We have 180,000 certified open source professionals in 180 countries around the world. And we can prove that people who are certified people, everything else being equal, that certified people make a higher salary and are more likely to get a job than uncertified people. So that's the end of the advertisement. The prognosis of this is every day the antagonists get worse. 25 years ago, the antagonists were script kiddies who grabbed a script on the web and executed it against 10,000 systems and broke in, then bragged to their friends and got caught by the FBI. But now we're talking about serious people that do ransomware, terrorism, and even entrepreneurs who create software to break into your systems. They don't use it themselves, they sell it to other people. And so the security issue is growing stronger and stronger every day. And people who thought, oh, I don't have to secure my system because nobody cares about me, all of a sudden find out that they're being hit for ransomware. Sometimes it's $5,000, sometimes it's $20,000. It's gauged to how much you actually have. So we're talking about the really serious folks, people like the NSA. Now just pretend for a moment that you don't live in the NSA, or the USA. I know that's hard to believe, because Canada's the USA of the North, right? I know, that's insulting, I'm sorry. But you also may be in Central America. You also may be in South America. I mean, I don't even call myself an American anymore. I'm a citizen of the USA, because I'm sensitive to this. But even if you live in the USA, there's another organization called the KSB, or the KGB, and they are from, of course, the Soviet Union. They call themselves something different now, but they are still the KGB. But what really keeps me awake at night, besides bad beer and bad scotch, is the fact that the Internet of Things is going to make this problem 50 billion times worse, where people creating these little devices and putting them out there, communicating with your servers, communicating with your systems, and the infrastructure that goes behind that is, I know companies that have nightmares, sweat nightmares, about the Internet of Things and what it's going to be bringing. So I'm not paranoid. I'm not paranoid because my conspiracy theories are true, okay? And I'm diabetic, and I'm fat, and I'm old, and I've had 3 heart attacks, so I'm not going to live very much longer. But you guys are. You're going to have to worry about all this, right? And so a final word to the CIOs, CEOs, CTOs, and all the Cs in charge of companies. You have to architect your security right now. There's no single magic bullet to this. It's up and down the line. And no system is completely secure. All you can do is secure your systems to the point that you can suffer the consequences if they're broken into, and buy yourself insurance. Here are some references for the people that are really interested in this type of stuff. Go to any of these websites and they will help you with different ideas and things to become a good systems administrator. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I still have 3 minutes left of my talk. That was amazing. I went really fast, I know that. For the people who speak French and have to translate it into English, I apologize. But now we can have questions.
Thank you so much, John Hall. Let's give a round of applause and get your questions to me in Slido. Hello, grab a seat wherever you would like.
Okay.
Grab a seat wherever you would like. So, someone says, Mariano says, hello from Brazil. That's the first one. So that's great to see you again at Campus Party.
I have 2 Brazilian godsons.
Oh, really? Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I actually have 2 goddaughters also, but those are the daughters of Linus Torvalds and his wife Tuve.
Wonderful. So, you know, myself, I wanted to ask this question, but we can skip it if it's, you know, been asked too many times. Where your Mad Dog nickname came from, or if...
Too many times.
Too many times? Okay, the moral of the story is you're a Zen guy now, right?
You can actually Google that on the net.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. The first question we have today that's not about Mad Dog is, would asymmetric encryption methods from blockchain potentially change the use of open source software? So that's maybe a good question to kick off with, for real.
Well, I actually know a professor down in Brazil that is using blockchain not only to manage the finances of solar power collection, but also because if the solar panel is removed from the blockchain, you see it immediately. And so he can tell immediately if somebody has tampered with his solar panel. I'm not the greatest expert at blockchain in the world. I've looked at it a little bit and everything, so I really can't talk too much about that.
Okay.
But I will say that I believe that cryptocurrency and blockchain have an amazing future as a utility.
Okay.
Not as something where you invest in and you think it's going to magically go up, okay? But as a utility, as an exchange for money, back and forth, I think it's got a fantastic future.
Okay, great. We have another question here from Charles. What advice would you give a company that's working on Microsoft but wants to increase its security?
Well, I mean, some of the things I talked about here work additionally well with Microsoft, okay? It's not completely broken. But the problem is, again, if you find a problem, if there's a problem found, then you have to wait for Microsoft to fix that problem if it's a problem inside the code itself. Now, I have an example of many years ago, there was something called the Morris worm. And it was attacking Unix systems, and the worm would just bring the Unix system down. It would just crash.
Oh.
And since most people in those days did not have the source code for Unix, they had to wait until the vendor brought out the module. And I was working for DEC. We had a retired system, much like Windows XP is retired. And my company was not going to bring out the bug fix for that. And I knew that there were still hundreds of thousands of people using our system. So I had to blackmail my company into bringing that system out, bringing that change out. And it still took us 3 weeks to do that. So these people were sitting there with their systems crashing for 3 weeks before we gave them the patch. The open source community, once they understood what the problem was, it took them 3 hours to generate the patch. And this is why InfoWeek magazine, for 3 years in a row, gave an award for best service, not to Hewlett Packard or IBM or DEC or any of those companies, but to the free software community.
Yeah.
And after 3 years of doing that, they never had that particular award again because they knew that every year it was going to go to the open source community.
Right. The power of collective intelligence, hey?
Right.
Right on. I have another question here from Flo, who finds the topic of cybersecurity very hard and wonders how paranoid they should be about their data, and more importantly, how paranoid their mothers should be.
Well, this is one reason why I try and tell people to architect their security.
Yeah.
I mean, if all of your data is represented by pictures of cats and your credit card numbers, you know, pictures of cats, hey, show them to everybody. You don't care. Put them on a nice system outside the in the DMZ zone. Let people enjoy them, but you don't do that with your, you know. So first, separate your data, realize what you want to protect.
Yeah.
And then try and protect your data on the most secure system you can.
Gotcha. So we're talking to a lot of folks today at Campus Party who are in university or just starting their career. And I'm curious what advice you have for them. And if you were starting your career again, would you do this, go down the same road, or would there be something else in the tech world that you'd explore given what you know now?
Well, first of all, you're talking to somebody who's 71 years old. I started my tech career in 1969. We didn't have computer science back then.
Right.
We only had computer black magic.
Okay.
We were stumbling in the dark. I actually programmed systems that used plug boards, where you would move wires around the plug board to indicate what instruction you were executing at a particular time. And your subroutine was this big square piece of metal that you would slide into the system, and then the system would do whatever you programmed.
Wow.
I can bring it forward a little bit and talk about Linus Torvalds. And Linus has said that if he was starting out today, he probably would not start an operating system because there wouldn't be any need to. Linux is already there. What he might do is look at field programmable gate arrays, programming them, seeing what, you know, and what I've seen is that the stack has been growing up. Because now operating systems, we have a fairly good idea of how they should work and things like that. Now we're looking for solutions.
Okay.
And I've said many times that people don't buy hardware. They don't buy software. Even, you know, they buy solutions to problems. And if what you want to do is play a game, and you can play that game with 2 tin cans with a string in between them, that's what you would buy.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I say to people, look at solutions as a place where you make your money, okay? Buy a solution for somebody, buy a stereo system that is flexible and stuff like that, create a home automation system. So the other places I would look is in IoT, because it's going to be a huge market for that, and AI.
Okay.
Although I'm happy, well, not happy. I really don't want to deal with AI because I read too many books back in the 1960s from Arthur C. Clarke and iRobot and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I kept telling my students back then, I said, look, if you ever create a computer that you can't unplug, you're a fool. You know? Okay. So I think that most people, when they talk about artificial intelligence, they're really not thinking well enough.
Okay.
So I don't like the term AI. I use the term inorganic intelligence.
Okay.
Meaning something that's not made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen stuff, but you could. And it's made of transistors and silicon and things like that. And since neurons are these tiny little donuts that, you know, you can store something in, and the synapses are the things that hook all these together, and magically the human mind, through an electrochemical reaction, can have intelligence. I don't see why you can't do the same thing with silicon. Given the fact that you had a large enough memory and a fast enough processor, why can't we have an inorganic intelligence in a machine that could do everything that the human mind could do?
Okay, very
And
interesting.
If that's the case, then there's nothing that a human being can think of that an artificially intelligent thing could not.
Definitely some food for thought there.
So CIOs, CEOs, CTOs, you better take care of your people because those machines will overcome you.
Oh, wow. On that note, I'm so sorry that we're out of time. I have like so many more questions now that we went on that path. Where should people find you, follow you? You're going to be around today, is that correct?
I'm going to be around the whole day. We have a workshop from 1 until 5 about how to install the FreedomBox software.
Right on.
I have some t-shirts from previous campus parties that I'm going to be raffling off. And I even have one of the little FreedomBox computers with a 1 terabyte disk drive that will be part of that raffle. So come to the workshop, and I'm going to have 2 of my compatriots from LPI helping out. So that's where you'll find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, John, for coming to Campus Party Canada. Let's give it up for John Hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you.